Hello everyone, very warm welcome to today's session. Today's lecture is titled Embodied Approach to Consciousness, Merleau-Ponty. So you all already know Dr. Saurabh Tudaria, so he requires no further introduction, I believe. This session is part of the Phenomenology and Social Research online course organized by the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. It has been organized by and it has been conceptualized by Dr. Saurabh and Dr. Sankita Menon. So we thank both of them, and we will now ask Dr. Saurabh Tudaria to begin his lecture. It will be for about 1 hour, and we'll be taking all the questions after that. Yeah.
Thanks, Meera. And as Meera has explained, that this is going to be lecture on Merleau-Ponty and especially on the phenomenology of embodiment. So this lecture has been developed according to the history of phenomenology, which we have started with the Husserl, then we have come to the Heidegger, and then to Merleau-Ponty. And in this, so I'm not engaging in the whole of the whole philosophy of complete philosophy of Merleau-Ponty, but especially his first part, especially when he talked about especially Merleau-Ponty of phenomenology of perception. And I'm leaving because of the limitation of the time. The second part, which is the invisible and the visible, but of course I would love to take it up during the interactive session. So without further ado, let us start this talk. So may I request Niharika? Yeah. So that we have already told you that the Merleau-Ponty, and this is the third lecture. Now, next slide. So we are today discussing this phenomenology of perception by Merleau-Ponty, and as some of you people who are already engaged with Merleau-Ponty or like studying it, so they know that that embodiment or body is the central concept of Merleau-Ponty. But before discussing the phenomenological and Merleau-Ponty's interpretation of body, let us try to understand how do we understand body in our general sense. So basically, and because once we have the grasp of the general and the ordinary understanding of common understanding of the body, then we are able to see that what the departure exactly is made by Merleau-Ponty. So how do we understand body? So the basic understanding of body in history of philosophy is of the instrument. That body is only an instrument. So like famously, like Kant also says that through that senses only gives us the data. So these are the means by which the sensory data is given, and actual processing and the realm of the knowledge takes place at the level of mind. That is why there are many kind of the thought experiments, especially Hilary Putnam's famous Brain in the Vat, on which this movie Matrix has been made, that if there is the possibility of producing the sensation without the body, then still we can have the knowledge, still we can have the experience. So this is the one. So in what connects all the discussions on body, that body is only an appendage. It is not something which is the central to the knowledge. It is only a mere instrument which whole task is to just to give the sensations. And somehow, if we are able to dispense with it and produce the sensation artificially, still we can have the experience, we can have the knowledge. Second understanding of the body is body as an outside. That there is the body is something which is outside, visible, which we can touch, tangible, while mind is something which is intangible, which is internal, and which is inside us. And third, like a social understanding of the body is related with the significance. The body is something which is signified socially. So there are some bodies which are considered socially important, some are considered not so important. Then there are difference between the dead bodies, corpse, or the living body. So in that sense, we generally, these are the some of the ways by which we understand the body. But the central point is that that body is basically considered as an mere instrument by which the sensation can be given, but the actual processing is done by the mind. So this comes full-fledged in Kant. The Kant's view of perception or the knowledge is basically sensory data plus concept. That you need the sensory data, the senses gives us because we are embodied being, and then there are the concepts. So these sensory data is actually processed by the concept, and then we have the representation of the knowledge. So this is broadly in history of philosophy is called as representational model of knowledge, which requires that there should be the sensory data, it should be combined with the concept, then we have the representation of the knowledge, then there is the representation. Representation, as the name suggests representation. Their reality is already out there and we are just presenting it the image of that reality. That is called representation. Yeah, next PPT. Now the question arises that is perception conceptual through and through? Like perception is something which is conceptual, like as the Kant famously said that intuitions without concepts are blind and concepts without intuitions are empty. So what he means to say that sensation, if are not processed by concepts, then they are blind and chaotic. So we need some concepts actually in order to give them the name and the form. So naming and giving them the form is actually the job of the language or of the concepts. So the perceptual act finally, does that mean that perceptual act finally culminates into the linguistic expression like PSQ? That, so do we mean to say that the language is the final telos of the sensation, because the sensation is something which is the blind, and finally this act of the knowledge leads to this act of the sensation finally leads to the linguistic expression like PSQ, when we are able to say something in the linguistically. So that is the whole school of the philosophy, representational theory of the mind, which believe that actually this is the case. They argue that all of our mental states or beliefs can be codified into the computation language or in the logical symbol. So famous linguistic term in philosophy, which is in the analytical philosophy, they basically argue that the consciousness cannot be thought independent of the linguistic expression. So our, this is of course started by the Frege and then took by the Carnap, Russell, and then early Wittgenstein, that finally they say that our consciousness understands the word in the terms of the language. And language as such follows certain pattern, which is called syntactical. It follows certain logic and the grammar, certain syntactical structure of the language. And if we analyze the linguistic structure, when we can get into the meaning of that. So the mental states or the beliefs can be codified into the computational language or the logical symbol. So natural language, like the language Hindi, English, or like Tamil, Telugu, whatever we are using, this is called the natural languages. So that might be confusing, but you can call out the logical language. For example, man is the mortal, that is possible in every possible word. So we have to see that P implies Q. So P can stand for anything in any language, but the meaning would remain unchanged. So the AI is basically based on this logical symbols. Artificial intelligence is based on this logical symbols. They actually imitate this symbolic representation that all the kind of the behaviors can be finally codified into the certain language, which can be further codified into kind of the logical symbols. and the combination of these symbols actually generate the behavior, what is called as the machine learning or the AI. So all this based on the representational theory of the mind. The mind basically represents the reality, what is called the picture theory, that there is a picture of everything, there is a kind of the symbols, and this combination of the symbols govern the behavior and the language. So we access the external reality through analyzing the syntactical structure of the various mental states and beliefs. So the external reality, our belief about the word, can be analyzed through the study of the language, through studying the syntactical structure of the language, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. So this is actually the basically based on the representational theory of the mind, which believes that the perception is conceptual. Next PPT. Now the question is that how the phenomenological notion of the word is different from that. Now, as some of you which have continuously attending all of these earlier classes, they must have they must have understood this point, that phenomenology never believed that there is a kind of a direct perception of the thing. We already have we already act our perception based on the background experiences. So there is our background experiences only on the basis of which we understand the thing. So so for example, if someone is going meeting a friend, so he understands the friend on the basis of the background structure, because he has some memories, he has certain kind of the background of the earlier experiences. On the basis of it, the word or the things are perceived. Husserl called this as the life word. Levins felt that this life word is something on the basis of which we are able to engage with the thing. So there is no innocent encounter with the things and the objects in the world. There's already kind of a social and the cultural structure which affects, which mediates our experience of the world. And as in the last class we had discussed about the Heidegger, that Heidegger call this as a equimental context. That when we use the hammer, every time I don't see the hammer and analyze that how it is used. To use the hammer means we already have a kind of the capacity, we know the context and situation. That's why we are able to use it. For example, in the talk, suddenly the phone comes, some message or WhatsApp come and somebody check that. He doesn't need to recall that this is the phone and this is the capacity I have. He will immediately start to work in that, because there is already kind of a trust in the things. We already have the familiarity with the word. So that is Heidegger says that there is already familiarity with the word. We are familiar to the word, and only on the basis of this familiarity we experience the thing. For example, how do we perceive the object, say a coffee mug? So suppose if we go by the sensation through and through, so coffee mug is something like only its outside is given to my senses. So do I understand, but I don't see the inside of coffee mug. I don't see the back side of the back profile of coffee mug. So do I see the coffee mug in the manner I check each and every side and stitch all these things together and then come up with the representation. That is just like in the children books, like children were doing, they connect the dots and then the picture emerges. Do I experience the coffee mug in that manner? The experience of the coffee mug is like that, connecting the dots and then coming up with the picture. It never happens like that. To see the coffee mug is to see it completely. I don't have to guess that it has an inside or it has the back side. Nothing like that. So we see it completely. So there is a kind of the visibility and in the object, and there is the invisible aspect of the object. So this is what phenomenology says, that we, on the basis of already previous sedimented experiences, we experience the things as such. Yeah, can you turn the page? Yeah. So this is the difference between the I see and I can. Now this is a very crucial difference between the representational model and the Morley-Ponty phenomenology, which of course is developed from Husserl's phenomenology. That representational model works on the basis of the I see, that I see the things. For example, I see the cup, so I am seeing it, I am able to represent the cup. If I am seeing a tree outside, so seeing the tree means that I must be able to represent the complete picture of tree, right? Now, Morley-Ponty says that actually our encounter with the things doesn't happen in the fashion of I see, but in the fashion of I can. That means to see a chair means I know that I can go to the chair, I can use it, I can go to the back side of the chair, I know how to use it. So the things actually provides our perception of the things is not like the neutral perception. They gives us a kind of a opportunity, kind of the possibilities in which I can access to that. For example, if I see suppose a car running with a very high speed or the train going away from the station with a high speed, I don't see, I don't try that I should just run and catch it up, because I know that, because my body or I already know that this is not the possibilities given by that object. I can only move, I can only catch the slowly moving train, not the fast moving train. So our perception of the things has not to be done only on the basis of the vision, but in the overall capacities of the possibilities, embodied possibility they offer. Hence, objects invoke the access in terms of the embodied possibilities. So my body actually gives me the, using this laptop means not to see it, but to know how to use it, how to go around it, how to expect how it will function. So all these kind of the possibilities is possible on the basis of the embodiment. Suppose if I'm a disembodied being, so according to the Morley-Ponty phenomenology, we are not able to experience the backside of the laptop because the body has this ability of kinesthetic ability to move around the things. That is why it thinks that it anticipates that there is a backside of the object, because I can move around and can see it. So body gives me the grip on the word. Morley-Ponty's argument is that body gives a grip on the word. Body, this word is something which my body provides me a grip. Sorry, earlier? Yeah. Hence, in Husserl, we move from the intentionality to the incarnated intentionality. So according to him, intentionality, phenomenological intentionality of Husserl has not to be seen only in the terms of the consciousness, but this consciousness is something which is embodied, which is incarnated into a body, and the subject is not a thing in terms of the subject-object duality, but this subject is a body subject. It is something which is the embodied subject, which projects the possibilities on the word on the basis of its embodiment. Next slide. So the notion of I can suggest that body is the locus of the experience. That the experience of the world is not to be seen in the terms of the conceptual capacities only, in terms of the ability to represent, but in terms of the I can. What are the possibilities which is offered by my body? That is why the person whose body is like trained in the yoga, for him his body offers different kind of the possibilities, while the person whose body is like an ill body, he sees the world in a different way, because his certain kind of the possibility has been has not been made accessible on the basis of his or her embodiment. So this body is orient us in the world. So body and basically give us orientation in the world. So this is what Merleau-Ponty calls as the 0 point. He says the body we can consider the 0 point, which become the frame of reference on the basis of which I am able to engage in the space. So a space is not something like, as we have discussed in Heidegger also, like an empty thing in which we just fill up the object. Like space is more like kind of the existential space. For me, the space is something which I orient on the basis of the left, right, near, far, below, above, backward, forward. And all these things can be understood in terms of the embodied possibility. For a disembodied person, if we didn't have the body, so for that person, the left, right things doesn't make the sense. So all these kind of the possibilities make sense because we have the body, and this body gives us orientation in the world. That is why the space is organized in the sense of the left, right, near, far, below, above. So this is what Hubert Raffles called that there is a more fundamental kind of knowing on the basis of which body is called as, on the basis of body, which is called as coping, Hubert Raffles. Now the interesting thing is that somebody might argue that, look, you are talking about the body, that our body has certain kind of the capacities, that it knows how to orient oneself as the light, right, left, near, far. Of course, granted that we know how to orient ourselves to space. So space become existential on the basis of body. Fine. But but can't we say that this body is all these movements of the body, the reflex action, they are like only the reflexes. So and this means there is no agency, because only on the body is just like a habitual on the basis of the reflexes it is working. So there is nothing like where is the role of agency in that? So basically then phenomenology is something which is only phenomenological notion of the body, something which is like a biological, which is like a instincts or the habits which have been learned. So Dreyfus respond that, look, there is a difference between the knowing. There is the one, of course, the knowing, which is called as the conceptual, which is, of course, everybody knows that this conceptual knowing is something intentional. For example, if I have decide that I have to learn Sanskrit or German, so there is a kind of the intention that I have to learn Sanskrit and German, and there is a goal. So this kind of the knowing is become the conceptual. Or I have to analyze the structure of some instrument. So this is kind of a intentional there, and this is the conceptual knowing. So of course, agent is there. And but he says, beside this conceptual knowing, there is another kind of the knowing, which is called as coping. Now, what is that? We will see in the next slide. So he come up with the examples. He says there is a difference between what we call that the knowing that and knowing how, which we had discussed in the earlier class also. That there are certain skills. And mind you, like just to introduce the Hubert Raffles, he's some very famous phenomenologist and has used the insights of the phenomenology in especially in the artificial intelligence, and and it is very difficult to talk of AI without referring to Hubert Raffles' account. So, and some of his important work, what computers can't do, and other things, and of course the book which I have shared on Heidegger. So he says that there is a difference between the knowing that and knowing how. So knowing that is something which is the conceptual knowledge, that I have to learn some new language, I have to solve a mathematical problem, I have to understand the structure of some tree or some biological organism. But he said there are some practical skills like knowing how, like swimming, dancing, riding, driving. So he says that this requires the harmony between the body and the skill, which he says that it requires expertise, which is called as the skillful coping. Now, what is the skillful coping? For example, someone is driving or like climbing on the mountain. So let us take the simpler example of driving. So someone is driving. Now, while driving, when he become an expert in the driving, so experts in the driving, they need not to always recall the rules which they were initially learning when they were learning the driving. So they have need not to recall all the rules and the regulation which are required. Rather, when they gradually become expert in driving, so their body get harmonized with car, and the driving is something which become a kind of a skillful coping. They are able to cope up with the situation. So this is also called as the being in the flow. Is even the people who are expert in the dances, so when they become the dancing or music, so when they totally get absorbed into what he called as the skillful coping, when they are totally become absorbed into the moves of the dances or the ragas or different kind of the instruments playing, so at that time they need not to remember the rules which they have learned. They don't always analyze when they are into the thick of their performance. Rather, this comes naturally, which is called the skillful coping. They have the sense of the overall situation, and they inherently know what to make, how to make the next move. So this doesn't require the conceptual knowing. So this he calls, in fact, this he calls as the skillful coping. So what he says, the previous experiences or previous coping up with the situation help us to sense and understand the situation. So phenomenological awareness, so this skillful coping is kind of the phenomenological non-conceptual awareness. So this is also a knowledge, but this is a non-conceptual knowledge. So phenomenological awareness is somewhere between the reflex and the conscious cognitive behavior. So one is the reflex. For example, if I'm giving this talk and some fly comes over here and I just move my hand. So according to the philosophy of action, this is not called the action. This is a movement because there is a reflex and no agency is there. On the other hand, there is another notion of the agency. When there is a conscious behavior, I know that I set the goal and I do the work accordingly. But in between that, there is a non-conceptual awareness. For example, suppose if I'm going to the market and while going to the market, I'm just going down a stair. So I have the remembrance of the larger goals that I have to go to the market, and going down a stair is one of the part of that. Somebody asks me where you are going. I don't say I'm going down a stair. I say I'm going to the market. So this means that there is even in this non-conceptual awareness, there is a kind of a goal setting. There is a kind of the agency involved. So how is it possible? Merleau-Ponty calls this skillful coping, this ability to cope up with the situation, not requiring the concepts, and on the basis of this non-conceptual, we are able to cope up with the situation as the dancer or swimmers does. So this he called it as the body schema. Body schema is a kind of the pre-reflecting and non-objectifying awareness of the body. That suppose if I am sitting and giving the talk, so I don't need to recall that I have two hands and I have to, before moving my hand, I have to check whether my hand is there or not. This is so there is already awareness of the body, that my body is touching this and my body is touching the chair and my body is touching the laptop. So there is a kind of a non-conceptual, non-objectifying awareness of the body, which is implicit. So that is why this is called the body schema. So that is why suppose if suddenly a snake enters into this hall, so my body will go out of this, because it knows that it can move to a safe situation. Yeah, next slide. So there is the one uh, passage, there is a one paragraph by Gallagher and Jahavi in the Phenomenological Mind. So they explain the body schema as the body schematic processes are responsible for motor control and involve sensory motor capacities, abilities, and habits that enable movement and the maintenance of posture. Such processes are not perception, beliefs, or feeling, but sensory motor function that continue to operate. When the intentional object of perception is something other than one's own body. On the other hand, however, the body schema also includes our pre-reflective, proprioceptive awareness of our bodily action. So, for example, if someone is playing the tennis, so while playing the tennis, his body totally becomes absorbed in the playing. Whenever the shot comes from the other side, he doesn't calculate mathematically, conceptually, this move has to make, he has to go this much of the distance, and then he would be able to hit. No, he knows on the basis of the skillful coping, he knows how to respond into the situation. We know, and that response of the body is not conceptual or calculative. It is something have a tacit and the non-conceptual awareness of the situation, that it has to cope up with this situation successfully, and for that coping his body provide what kind of the possibilities the body provides and what it doesn't provide. So the shot which he thinks, which are, for example, a fielder in the cricket match, if so he knows how much he can jump, he doesn't feel that he can fly and he can have the catch. So he knows. So similarly, the person knows that how much he could stretch the body, how much he could not. That is why he leaves some shots and he tries some other kind of the shots in return. Next. So there is kind of this is the phenomenological point, that there is already pre-reflected and the non-conceptual grasp of the world. So here we are again coming back to the point that there is one representational theory of the mind which says that word is accessible in terms of the representation, and the body is something like a body is something which is like only an external appendage or the instrument whose whole task is just to provide the sensation or the occasion, and it is the job of the mind to process it. At the level of the sensation, there is the blindness, and the clarity comes at the level of concept. Now, phenomenology argues that even at the level of between this blindness of the sensations and the conceptuality of the mind, there is a phenomenological non-conceptual grasp of the world, where you have the overall sense of the situation, and your body and our body gets absorbed into that situation so that it can cope up with that. And as such, it doesn't require the concept and the representation. So body recedes to the background and the non-objectifying awareness of the body. For example, if the person is climbing the mountain, he just body recedes to the background, and his body becomes attuned with the environment around it, and he just cope up with that environment on the possibilities which is provided by the body. So that is why a climber knows that what moves it can make, what moves it cannot make. So it tries in that context only. So there is nothing like, so there is a structure or kind of provided by the body, and he makes his move accordingly. But all this has been not made conceptually, but non-conceptually. So environment become the word of affordances. So word outside is not something which is an object which we can see. The mountain is not some object for a climbman, for a mountaineer. So it becomes the word of affordances, that this mountain, how much he can climb, how much he or she cannot climb. So it giving, as the basis of his embodied passivity, it gives him certain affordances. What kind of the moves or what kind of the possibilities he or she can afford and what it cannot afford. I know that the moving train is not a moving object. It is like a word of what it can afford. If it is a slowly moving, I can afford to go and catch it. And if it is moving very fastly, I cannot, I better watch it. I cannot catch it. So now there are some other things like a painful body that sometimes the body becomes painful. For example, someone is playing some match or like a tennis match or some other kind of the match, and he's playing skillfully, and suddenly the body, some pain, he develops some pain. At that time, his body, there would be the disruption of the ICAN. He can no longer play. That is why it becomes so painful body disrupts this ICAN. So that is the difference, that in painful body there I can no longer afford the word. For example, the person who is the ill in hospital bedridden, so the earlier words, so he cannot afford the same kind of the experiences in the word which he used to enjoy. He cannot do certain, especially the people who have some of the people who have the breathing difficulties. So, so some of the environment they cannot afford. Earlier they used to afford when their breathing was normal. So the painful body is something which disrupts the sense of the I can. Ill body is something which disrupts or kind of the truncates the embodied possibilities. Yeah. Next slide. Now we come at the heart of phenomenology of perception, when in which Merleau-Ponty talks about the lived body. What is this lived body? There is a present body like the body I am having right now, but at the same time all the experiences which I have from my childhood all get sedimented to my body. And this sedimentation of the previous experiences, this produces the lived body. And this lived body gives us the horizon of possibilities. For example, a sportsman who has from the very early age, he started to play the sport, his lived body will afford him a different kind of the possibilities in the world, while the person who is not a sports person, his or her lived body or his body will give him a different kind of the possibilities in the world. So all these possibilities which we are exploring in the world is based on our lived experiences, all the kind of the experiences which gets accumulates in our body. So this gives us a grip on our surrounding. On the basis of my, for example, if I know how to climb the mountain or how to, for example, we all, every time coming to our offices or our classes, we don't check every time the flow, every time the door, whether the door is working or not, that whether we don't every time think what the way has to be taken, which path I should take. So this gives, on the basis of our previous experience, we just go around in the world. So this is the experience of the lived body. Now, Merleau-Ponty explains it through the example of the phantom limb. As most of you are knowing, that phantom limb is a different kind of the experience in the person who has some his limb is amputated because of an accident or some other thing, but they always feel pain in that area. They feel as if the leg is there. So what he says, according to Merleau-Ponty, that in what happens in the case of the phantom limb, there is a kind of the disruption between the lived body and the present body. All the experiences he had was on the basis of the lived body. in which there was a leg, in which that was a kind of the complete body. Now, after the amputation of the leg, there is a kind of the disruption between the lived body and the present body. And it is very difficult to accommodate the lived body with the present body, because body's job is to give us the orientation and grip on the world. And this balance we have learned throughout our life how to. So that is why even if the leg is not there, so the people who lost their limb, they feel as if the leg is there. That gives them the orientation, because body is required for the orientation, and this new kind of this amputated body doesn't give them the orientation. So that is why the lived body, on the basis of the lived body, the orientation is made possible. And this is how the body is something which is so pervasive to our experiences. Like good mood or health is like the situation when we are able to plug ourselves with the environment. Like happiness or like the grief or the loss, if we like explain these experiences, so they are all the bodily feelings are associated with that. In a good mood, I am able to plug in with my environment very successfully without any ado. While when my mood is bad or I have certain kind of the grief, loss, at that time I find the same kind of the activities which I was coping with the world in a very easily manner, I find it very difficult to do. So according to Merleau-Ponty, this is happens on the basis of the lived body, because the lived body already had all these kind of the experiences which have the sediments on it. It gives a orientation and kind of the possibilities which it can explore in the world. Now, in the case of the phantom limb, when the limb is gone or like some part of the body is gone, there is a disorientation between the lived body and the present body, which creates this kind of the problem. Even in the COVID-19 times, we have all experienced the same peoples who have a, like we already have the experience of moving around easily with the environment, with our faces open, we can like shake hand with any person, we can go about anywhere. But suddenly the body has been coiled up because you have to put the mask. There is a threat of infection and all that. So body is like cutting. So that is why there is a kind of the disorientation, because there is already the lived experience of the the body which we can stretch out. But on the other hand, the present situation is which is constraining the body. So this disorientation between the lived body and kind of the present body, this causes the stress. I think Neha is here. So Neha is also doing research on that, only Dr. Neha. So she has done the doing the extensive research on this aspect, how the people are suffering depression and the kind of the mental health problem during the lockdown time. But the point is that this disorientation between the lived body and the present situation or the present body, that creates all these kind of the experiences. Next slide. Now the thing is that we have to understand, that we have to see that what is the kind of the legacy or kind of the what are the, because this is also the class which is this is also the course which is basically dealing with the social research, and some of the people have mailed me that they are dealing with the many social problems and how what the phenomenology can be relevant into these problems. So I tried to I thought that it is also important to give some contemporary account also that what is currently going on in phenomenology, so that in the social research and in phenomenology, so that people can know, they can relate with their research. So one is that like Merleau-Ponty has influenced the cognition in a profound way. So now we have a category of the embodied cognition itself, which is by Dan Jahabi, Hubert Dreyfus, whose work is kind of a seminal in AI, and Francisco Varela, who has connected Merleau-Ponty with the neurosciences and with the Buddhism, Buddhist meditation practices also. And some of the researches on the embodied cognition is also happening in the field of education, that how especially in the child education, we have to see the knowledge or the learning capacities not as something in the representational mode, or the ability to like represent the concepts or certain skills, but rather we have to see the knowledge in terms of the skills, in terms of the embodied cognition, and how the various kind of the modules, education modules can be made, which involve more kind of the embodied activities, which can lead to the better learning. Habitus, those people who are in sociology, they need no introduction of Pierre Bourdieu, is one of the most formidable scholar of the present time. So he gave the concept of the habitus, which is also based on the notion of the lived body of Merleau-Ponty. Habitus is kind of the background structure on the basis of which we interact with each other. For example, if a cup of coffee come, so we know how to use it. We don't require any kind of a teaching in that. There is also some contemporary criticisms of Merleau-Ponty. For example, Michel Foucault. His argument is that look, it is fine that the body is something which has the background structure. We, on the basis of our embodied capacities, we interact in the world, but this body is normative. This is something which is in the world and is controlled and docile through various disciplinary mechanism. Hence, there is the limit to the body. What are the possibilities body has and what the possibility it doesn't have. It depends on the kind of the social and the power structures we are in. And then there is the Butler's criticism, Judith Butler's criticism of Merleau-Ponty, that Merleau-Ponty's account of body would be like a neutral body. This is a male neutral body, and there is the absence of the gendered body in Merleau-Ponty. So she takes up this insight. Same is seen by the Louis Gray, who gets that Merleau-Ponty doesn't talk about the sexual difference. There is a sexual difference also in the bodies. Also, there are the different kind of the bodies, especially female body. So he doesn't talk about that at all. And I think this can also be extended to the issue which are the contemporary, the work is going on the Dalit bodies, which is taken by the Gopal group, black bodies, Fanon's work, which is usually influenced by the Sartre and other phenomenology also. And the queer bodies, Sara Ahmed, who is queering the phenomenology. But again, in the defense of Merleau-Ponty, I can say that there is still the difference between the phenomenology and critique. Phenomenology is something which is more giving the first order and the fundamental structure of the experiences, that how the body experiences, what are the fundamental structures of the experiences. While Foucault, Butler, who comes from the feminism, Gopal Guru, Fanon, and all these, Sara Ahmed, they have adopted the standpoint of the critique, that in philosophy that we need to reflect on our historical situation, that I'm a gendered body, I'm a Dalit person, I'm a like a queer, and then we have to reflect on these experiences and use use these experiences to disrupt the established understanding. So this is a more the philosophy as a praxis, which is started by the Marx, and then it is in the critical theory. So this is the larger debate between the phenomenology and the critique. While the phenomenological people will not agree with that, they say, okay, our job is just to describe what is there. So you can't ask us that why we have not done this. So this is a larger debate. So we can discuss this later also during interactive session. So with this, I end the discussion. And yeah, next slide. Yeah, I end the discussion. Thank you very much for your patience. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a very interesting session on embodiment. Now we'll take some questions. We already have some. If you have more questions, please type it out in the chat box and we'll be taking them one after the other. I'll first go with Naveen's question. It's an example of the experience of perception where the mind makes it appear as though the sensory organs are actively involved in producing those experiences.
Can I open the chat? One sec. I just trying to open the chat box.
Yeah, sure, sir. The first question by Naveen.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So, can you repeat the question?
Are dreams an example of the experience of perception, where the mind makes it appear as though the sensory organs are actively involved in producing those experiences?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. I don't know I would be able to answer. But the quick answer is that even the dream objects, what we see, they are actually the copy or a kind of the mechanism even in the dream objects is derived from our experiences of perception only. So the way we perceive the things in the actual life, even in the dreams, even the object is there, but our perception of them is actually happens in the same way. I don't think I ever had a dream where I could penetrate it into the object. Whenever I see the object or a person, I always see the way I see in the actual life, even it is aware, but never it did my dream. I see any object and I was able to penetrate into the inside of that object. At least I didn't have any that kind of the dream. So, or even in the dream object, there is not all the profile of the object can be visible. There will be always the there is the front side of the object, there would be the back side. I don't think the all profile will like unfold before myself. So I'm not sure that I would be able to answer it, but I think this, but that is what is coming to my mind. I feel that there is a kind of more or less the mechanism, even if the dream object is there, but mechanism of the perception more or less remain the same. So that is what I could answer. I would love if you can like write, if you have something more to add on that later on, you can say.
Sure, sir. We have two questions regarding clarifications. One is Shayan is asking you to clarify on embodied possibilities, and Sobia is asking you to clarify on the concept of 0 point.
Okay. Yeah. So this embodied possibilities we can better understand if we like understand it is in contrast with the history of philosophy. Like whenever you see the example in the history of philosophy, most of the time these are the examples of the perception that I see the object, I see the snake as a rope, I see some person out there. So there is always the perception that the privileged relationship with the world is in the terms of the perception, in terms of the seeing. So this is called there is a vision centric things. But phenomenology says that, okay, that is fine. We don't contest that, but phenomenology is like going back to the experience just to show how we are experiencing the thing. So when we are seeing any kind of object, say if I'm seeing a coffee mug, so my sensations are only providing me the outside of the object. I don't see the inside. I don't see the backside. But still I see it is a coffee mug. I don't stitch all these experiences together as if I'm stitching the dot and coming up with the representation. So they ask, how is it possible? They say this is possible because of our embodiment. Because on the basis of our embodiment, I know that if I move around the object, then back profile will be visible to me. If I peep into the coffee mug, I can see the inside. So all these things are made possible because of the possibilities of the capacities offered by the body. So there are many kind of like Dan Jahabi has given the many example of the experiments, especially this neuropathological experiment in which the people have lost this kinesthetic capacities of the body. So their perception becomes very limited. They cannot perceive the things in the way we are perceiving. So hence, this is the embodied possibilities. We project on the basis of our kinesthetic kinesthetic ability of our body, we are able to see the object in total. Yeah. Then there is a explain the concept of the 0 point. Now the 0 point is actually we need to understand on the basis of the existential notion of the space. So there is a one like a theoretical account of the space, geometrical space with the mathematics conceive talks of. Then there is a existential space which sometimes interestingly Dancha we call it as the egological space. So what means that space is like made as a mind space on the basis of my embodied capacity. That I say, okay, this is left to me, this is right to me, this is above, this is far, so this is all kind of the space has been experienced in the terms of my embodied capacities, like the near, far. So where do you, but in order to say the left, right, near, far, so what would be the point of the reference? He said the point of the reference is the body, it is the 0 point, and this is the point of the reference, and on the basis of it, I say this is left to me, right to me, this is near, this is far. So this, when he talks about the 0 point of body as a 0 point, he just saying that how through the embodiment, this space is existentialized. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Now we will take a question from Shaunak. Shaunak, are you here? Would you like to ask the question yourself? Shaunak?
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. Please go on.
Okay, so I assume that there cannot be a phenomenological description of sleep, since in sleep there is a lack of positional consciousness. So how can this non-conceptual bodily awareness help us maybe do a phenomenology of sleep, and how would one go about it? The next thing is, so from sleep to waking, we transition from having mere bodily awareness to coming back of this positional consciousness, right? So what exactly is the relation between positional consciousness and our this non-conceptual bodily awareness?
Can you explain what is this positional consciousness? Because I don't understand what do you mean by that?
As in just consciousness that always takes an object, intentional, one with intentionality, that's all.
Okay, okay, fine. Thank you.
I took the notion from Sartre. So.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, this is an interesting question, and I think Jean-Luc Nancy has a whole book on the phenomenology of sleep, and there is a kind of the debate, especially Jean-Luc Nancy says that phenomenology of sleep is not possible, and why it is not possible? Because phenomenology is sleep is not that sleep is something which is not a lived experience, because in the sleep, the moment in which we fall asleep, we are not, because sleep is something which is on the basis of certain fundamental absence of myself, because I cannot be conscious at the fall asleep at the same time. There has to be a structural absence, then only the sleep is possible. Now this is the deconstructive mode, which is like he has taken from Derrida, that how the something which is the absence is something which is the condition of anything the present, but this absence, like being my absent in the sleep, falling asleep, is something which will change the phenomenological over of lived experience. So that is fine, but phenomenology never talks of never claimed that it will give the phenomenology of sleep. In fact, Husserl's later work are dealing with this problem only, how the phenomenology of sleep can be possible, especially after the he just want to inquire that how the time is possible, because there is some continuum of the time, and how there is some continuum of the time, and but this time is something which just does not happens in his notion of the retention and the protension. So this is like I agree with you that this is more deconstructive mode, and that is where the phenomenology of sleep I also think is not possible, because this is something which is like in between, because you need to be absent so that the sleep can be possible. And if there is a wakefulness, then the sleep is not possible. So this is a kind of a deconstructive mode there. Then how the transition from the bodily awareness to the positional consciousness in the waking hour. So yeah, so this positional consciousness, like the suppose positional consciousness, if I understood you, that positional consciousness means something which we can thematize. Okay, this is the thematic kind of the experiences. This is thematic space. This is the table, chair, and all that. So this, according to Merleau-Ponty, that body make is possible, like something which is the existential space, which is made possible on the bodily awareness because of through the bodies. First of all, I will existentialize space as a mind far near. This gives me orientation or the grip on the world. And the thematic consciousness, or like the positional consciousness, when I will later terminalize, give it some term, that would be the on the basis of this fundamental bodily awareness of the gripping. So that's how we can understand that this is the bodily awareness which gives me orientation in the world, that is the fundamental, and the more like a thematic awareness or the positional awareness of space is possible on the basis of this non-conceptual thematic, non-conceptual awareness. I hope I satisfied you. You can ask further if you didn't like, if you have this is not clear or you find it is not didn't satisfy you.
Okay, I think.
Hi.
Yeah. Shaunak?
Yeah. So you say that this bodily awareness is more fundamental than with intentional consciousness that we experience the world through. But isn't this bodily awareness also kind of it gets constituted as we grow up from being a baby, right? So how on what basis are we saying that the bodily awareness is more fundamental to intentional consciousness?
Yeah.
If we take from birth, for example.
So as you are saying about this baby thing, for example, this thematic awareness, this intentional, because in the even in the pre-linguistic stage, the child which doesn't have the hold of the concepts, right, or the language, still it know how to cope up with the situation, how to cope up with the, how to move about the body in the world. So this motility, or what like Merleau-Ponty talks about the motor intentionality, this gives him the orientation in the world. In the absence, because the conceptual and the language will come later. That is why there is some very interesting connection between the Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology and the animality. That animal who doesn't have the conceptual or the language, still they can move, they can cope up with the environment, they can have a non-thematic awareness of the world. So that's what I would say. We can discuss it more later. You can mail me also.
Okay, thank you, sir. I just wanted to add, Bermudez has also written on non-conceptual mental content and also about somatic perception. So maybe now Nikit is asking you for another example for environment affordances.
Yeah, so this is again environment as the word of affordances. Like, for example, I have given this example earlier also, that if we see a car, so car is, when we am seeing the car, so how do I know that this is the car? Do I, and I see the front side of the car and say, okay, that the car is standing out there. Do I say, okay, only the front, do I say only the front side of the car is there? Do I check around the car, see this back profile, and then connect all together? And I say, okay, I have checked it, and now I can say this is the car. So no, that doesn't happen in that way. So what we know that if I move around the world, my body, the kinesthetic ability of my body and the space around me grant me the afford me the space and the possibilities by which I could see. That is why I say that is car is there. suppose if there is a very fast moving object, or so I say I didn't know what it happened, what was it, because my body and my body schema does not allow me to perceive it and to move around it, because it is so far which my senses or body couldn't grasp. So this, so that kind of the object doesn't afford me the accessibility. So that is why we say that the word is environment. Afford is the word, environment is the word of affordance. What we can afford, what we cannot afford on the basis of our embodied capacity. Yeah. So this is largely phenomenological notion of the word, which is away from the subject and the object. Word is something out there as an object, and I am like away from it. So this is how both are connected.
Niharika, can you please take over for a minute? I think my video is stuck, unfortunately. Niharika?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm here.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Regarding the feedback form links, the last class of this course is the upcoming Monday. So Meera will be sharing the feedback form links with you then. And after that, we also have a panel discussion. The details also, Meera will be floating it soon. And the next question, I think I'll just, Meera, do you want to take up the question now?
Yeah, I can. So we'll just take Paul Sakaria's question if he is around. Paul?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah, yes, please go on.
Okay. I wanted to know if there is a difference between the kind of contexts that change body schema, I mean, affect body schema. Like, is there a difference between regions or economic status or the way our house is built, and the difference, and is it different from the kind of dependence it has on our ability, disabled bodies? Is that clear? I'm not sure if.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this question. In fact, this is like a very important question, because that is what later taken up by the many kind of the, especially the people in the critical theory, by the psychoanalysts, by the feminists, and by the other people also, especially in the disability study. So you are right actually, because the thing is that Merleau-Ponty gave us a kind of a structural account, like kind of the fundamental account of our experience in the world, of the world. That body schema is something which which enables me to cope up with the world. Body schema means like kind of the embodied capacities I have, and this embodied capacity I need not to access always conceptually. It is something which is sedimented in the form of the lived body. Now, interesting thing is that now many people are extending this argument that look, the body schema for a female and the male is different. The way the male picks up the object and the female is picking up the object, move around in the public space, and the female moves around in the public space, or kind of the LGBTQ people move around, or like straight people. So this all is different. And that is what very interesting if we connect this with the notion of the habitus in Pierre Bourdieu, which he says that even look, this context is also the powerly structure with the body, and especially the disability thing is also. Now the thing is, interesting thing is that we have to also like explore that the people who are disabled from the very early age, from the how their body schema is different, and what kind of the body schemas the people who feel the disability in the later stage of their life, or like, yeah. So that's good question. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Next, we'll take Victor Banerjee's question. Victor? Victor is not here. Okay. So how will you differentiate between the painful body, which limit the possibility of I can, and the painful body emerging through the eroticism of BDSM?
What is BDSM? Can you explain? What is this?
Maybe we can take a different question probably, and we can
We'll just avoid this question.
Yeah, we can take a different question. We'll take a question. Could it be possible that neuroatypicals remain distant or unsocialized from many givens of life world, leaving them creatively free to conjure their own realities?
Okay. So is Sudha around? Can she elaborate neuroatypicals? Can she elaborate on that? This question, is she around?
Sudha, she's not in the meeting.
Sudha.
So maybe we can take these in the chat box as well, sir. Just move to Sobia's next question. Can you please explain the concept of spatial levels and their shifts, and also the experiment used by Merleau-Ponty to illustrate this?
Okay, so I don't know which experiment she's talking about it. Is Sobia around?
Sobia, is you?
Yeah, hi, sir. Sir, actually, this is the mirror experiment about the speciality of a room that Merleau-Ponty has talked about in his paper. And when he's talking about experiential levels, so to say. I couldn't understand it totally because it was a little
Yeah,
textual.
is this experiment was in eye and mind, if I am right, correct?
There was this reading that was floated. It was perception, normativity, and selfhood. This is wait a minute. This is So in this writing, it's by Rhodes. It's by Maria Teliro. So she talks about this experiment. It's in phenomenology of perception.
Yeah. So I'm sorry that I don't recall this experiment right now. If you can explain it, then I can elaborate on it, because I don't remember that I have. If you can explain it.
He talks about the orientation of the mirror and the way we look at the room through that mirror. And he then talks about how certain things called anchorages, right? I couldn't totally get it, so that's why I needed help. So he says that there are objects which act as our anchors in the world, which is what you at some point of times were talking about, right?
Yeah.
Not by the term anchorage, but maybe a different concept of the body.
Yeah. Now I got it. So basically,
How if we rotate the mirror by some angle, it would be very difficult for us to embody this different understanding of the room through that mirror. And how do we then, I don't know, reorient ourselves, something of that sort?
Yeah, I got the point. Actually, this is first of all, this experiment, or this is taken by Kant actually in this Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, that if when he was talking about the space, and he said in the mirror, suppose if we are in the mirror and we shift the things, so through the mirror we are not able to orient ourselves, because if we put the two mirror in before us and we are between that and we put the object, then we will get confused. So what they actually want to prove, both Merleau-Ponty and Kant earlier, that the relationship between the space and orientation, what you have called as the anchorage. So this is the space is something which orient ourselves in the world. So that is why, if for example, Heidegger says that suppose if the thing in a dark room, if the things which are on the left side, which are kept in the right side, and the right side things kept in the left side, we will get disoriented. And same thing in this essay also, Merleau-Ponty said that suppose in the darkness of the night, what is actually I'm afraid of, because I'm not able to anchor myself, because there is the pitch darkness and the objects which give me anchorage in the world, on the basis of which I can able to move around my body and fit myself in the surrounding is lost. So this loses the grip in the world. Hence, that is why I think the speciality is something which is related with the orientation, that how the space is something which help us to orient in that. So that is what I can think of right now, but I will think about it more and then we'll discuss this.
Thank you so much, sir.
We will take Vibhuti Shastri's question now. Shia. So the question is, in people suffering from mental health issues, is the embodied perception changed?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and that is what I have also like in the concluding while concluding my lecture, this talk, I referred to that especially this embodied perception is basically is the embodied capacities. What Merleau-Ponty talks as the I can, what my body enables me to do things in the world. Now, in the mental health issues or in the kind of the like in this kind of the situation, this becomes slightly this capacities of the body become truncated, because the same place, for example, easily I used to go for the morning walk and meet with the people, chat with the people, but I don't feel like that. Even the small distance sometimes looks very kind of disorienting to me. One of the interesting example is given by Levinas when he talks about the insomnia. He says like in an ordinary, we always expect something new in the upcoming moment, that something new will come. But the person who is suffering from the insomnia, he expects in the next moment also he will not sleep, and in the after that moment he won't be able to sleep. So there is kind of the hanging of the time. There is the sameness of the thing which kind of disrupt him of his existence. So these kind of the embodied possibilities, so to say, is truncated and kind of the frozen in some of the mental health issues. So this is the larger phenomenological point, better about the mental health issue, what exactly they have, specifically the people who are in the psychology or in the they will be able to tell.
Okay. We'll take Sanjana's question, and Sanjay, we will come back to you since you have many questions depending on time. So we'll take Sanjana's question. Sanjana?
So, sir, I had also a question about the spatial shift that is spoken about in the mandatory reading that we had. So there, like Toledo is kind of interpreting Merleau-Ponty, and she says that the spatial shift can occur when we see a different like visual spectacle that is different from like our current spatial orientation, and it is possible to move from where we are now to like this new spatial orientation even if only we can just see it, even in the mirror or wherever else. So I guess my first question is, what causes that shift? Is it just the intention of wanting to like embody this person that we're seeing in that visual spectacle that might be different from us? And is it just like will or intention? And two, like when we embody this person in a different like visual spectacle and where we are shifting or we are experiencing like a spatial shift, does that mean that you can feel sensations that this other virtual body might be feeling, such as like pain or grief? Like, does that make sense? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, that is, I think this is actually this is something the later part of Merleau-Ponty, which I have not discussed actually. This is because I thought it would make it more complicated. But of course, because this question has been come up, so I would like to discuss it here. That basically Merleau-Ponty, later he talks about the flash, or what he called as the double sensations. So he gives the example of the hand actually, that when the left hand touches the right hand, so after some times we feel that the one hand is touching and also the another hand is getting touched. So this is the double sense. And after some time we are not in the situation when we are able to say what is touching and which hand is touching and what is getting touched, right? So this he says a double sensation, and he said this is a flash of the body. Now he extends these things to the others also, that he says when I shake the hand with some other person, then again I feel the double sensation. I touch his hand, I am also getting touched. Then he says that even in the visual perception, I see the things and I look at the things, and at the same time I am being looked at. So this is called the, what he said, the double sensation or the flash of the word, which is called as the intertwining chiasm and all that, which I will discuss in more detail in the another course actually on Thursday, which is developed by Meera Menon, Quintessence of Being. So this is double sensations and this ability to see the things and being looked at. He said this causes this kind of the shift, a spatial shift, because I see that I'm not only the subject but also an object. I have something which look and also being looked at. So I feel the word is not something which is an object, but is made of myself also. So that is why I say there is an intertwining, the flesh of the word become me and I become the flesh of the word. So this is actually the larger argument. And this, why he does that? Because the later Merleau-Ponty is very different from the earlier Merleau-Ponty, because he criticizes, he says that, look, I want to come out of this project of subject, object, consciousness, all this. I want to use the new vocabulary, which overcome this kind of the subject and the object divide. And that is why he comes up with this new kind of the terms like intertwining, chiasm, looking and being looked at, which gives kind of, which says that we don't know where the self is and where the word is started. So the kind of the intertwining between them, and interestingly, this intertwining gives us the transcendence, because when I touch the other and also get touched, so I come out of myself and become the other. So somebody sees me and I see her or him, and so that is also getting like being looked at. So this double sensation, this ability of the body, which is called as the flesh, is something which makes us both the immanence and the transcendence. But I hope, I don't know whether you are registered for that course. I will discuss in detail in that class about it.
Okay.
You can contact Meera regarding that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll get back to you.
Thank you.
So Nurjat's question also, I think we can definitely take it in the chat box since we're running a little short of time. We'll take Beata's question now, and that'll be the last one for today. We will take all the other questions in the chat box. So Beata, if you want to ask a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm as I've written, I'm in a pretty noisy place, so I will just read the question myself. So can we say that according to Merleau-Ponty, this act of thinking is always founded on the experience sedimented in the body, which has a specific markers, as you were actually already talking before, and location in the world. So this reminds me of the concept of the situated knowledge by Donna Haraway. But I'm wondering, like, about the act of conceptual thinking, according to Merleau-Ponty. How can you, like, can you say something? Can you elaborate on that, please?
So the thing is that, so one is that he talks about the situated knowledge, like there is nothing like the Cartesian subject which is parachuting on the word. So this is just like we have already have the background, we are situated on our background on the basis of which the experience takes place. Now again, another thing is that how the conceptual thinking takes place according to Merleau-Ponty. Now the interesting thing is that this is an interesting question, and Merleau-Ponty has not dealt with it because he said that he's more interested into phenomenology, how the experiences are given, how we experience, how does the body plays the role in it. And like all the phenomenologists, especially Heidegger, they say that this conceptual knowledge is something derivative of this tacit non-conceptual knowledge. Because when this has become the second order or question when I reflect, because there is a one there is a one first order non-conceptual experience of the self when I'm talking with you, everything doing there. So there is the awareness of the body and the self. But when I reflect that, okay, how as a person who has a kind of the diachronic identity, like in the historical cultural play, then it becomes the reflected kind of the identity. And then I try to engage into the concept, that what are the concepts, how they are useful. So in Merleau-Ponty, we doesn't have this kind of the conceptual account, but yeah, there are some people like Hubert Raffles, and there is like a McDowell's Life, Mind and the Word, where they are just trying to connect what is the connection between this non-conceptual and the conceptual, what is actually connects that. So this is like a larger debate in phenomenology, in philosophy of perception. So thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So we will not be any questions now. We will take all of them in the chat box, like I said earlier.
Yeah, but before concluding, yeah, can you? Yeah, that is because that is pertaining, because Meera is actually also working on the non-conceptual. So it would be very useful for all of us if you can also elaborate on your that how the people who are interested in that. Can you tell?
So not too much about the perceptual and the conceptual and non-conceptual, but I think the understanding is that, at least from my field of work, that pre-linguistic communities and even in occult practices, there is some relation to the non-conceptual understanding of things. I think to some extent, the images that we have in our heads and the mental content that we have is understood to be largely conceptual. And language also has a large part to play in terms of concepts. So I remember the easier way in which you were explaining to me how something like a pen, we understand the pen based on that it has a top, it has a body. So we have different concepts to understand what it is. But the non-conceptual mental content would be our awareness, which does not have conceptual contents. Like we might not have clear-cut categories of understanding it. That is all I want to talk about as of now.
Just I can add a couple of.
Sure. Please go.
This is very interesting because this is like pertaining with relevant to this lecture. So Meera has been suggesting that to add on that in one of like a discussion that how if you take because the notion of the agency is mostly related to the conceptual, that the person having some goal setting, then we say okay, he is an agent. But and non-conceptual, especially in the healing tradition, where the person has not become the sole agent, there is he says he's invoking some power, something is happening, and there is a kind of the field. There is a kind of the field which is actually like or the theatrical performance which is actually carrying out the healing. So here the non-conceptual is very important, because this is something like it is kind of this is a very thin notion of the agency, that agency not located in the person actually setting the goal, but is in the coping with the situation, and then something is happening. So it is neither like a blind practice is following of the rituals, nor it is like a conceptual goal setting. So this is very interesting thing. So I thought that would would be interest to you. So that's why.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now I'll just mention about the readings for the next class. The mandatory reading would be Continental Philosophy of Social Sciences by Jon Scherrer, chapter 4 and 5. And the suggested reading is Hans Gadamer's Truth and Method, part 2, chapter 4, page 267 to 306. No worries, I'll be putting these up in the WhatsApp group as well. The next class will be on next Monday, 5th October 2020. The title for the class is Interpretation and Existence, Gadamer's Hermeneutics. So thank you, everybody. We will take more questions in the discussion, for discussion in the chat box. So yeah, thank you, sir, and thank you, Niharika, Abhishek, and Ashwin for all the support. And we will see you for the next class.
Thank you all of you.